So why did the Jews of Jesus' day have him killed? I suppose there's probably a lot of true answers. Today what we're going to do is examine a video by Dan Gallagher over at Biblical Unitarian on his answer to that question. It's going to be a good case study in just how far Unitarians are willing to stretch common sense just to avoid what's so obviously in the text. Let's get started.
The other day I received a question which I felt was really pretty good and needed to be answered. The person asked, why did the Jews have Jesus executed? They went on to say, I had been taught that Jesus claimed to be God, and so that's why they had him killed. Is this true or not, and does the Bible have anything to say specifically about this?
Now, the question before us isn't just why the Jews wanted to kill Jesus. They, as I said, obviously many had different reasons, many sinful reasons for wanting to do that. The real question is, what did they use as a justification to have him executed? And what did they mean by the statements that they said?
As you're turning to Matthew 26, though, I want to explain that for as long as 4 months prior to Jesus' arrest, the Jews had been specifically approaching him, the leadership, and saying, who are you? Who do you claim to be? In fact, in John chapter 10, verse 24 is recorded. It says, the Jews gathered around him saying, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us. The question was, if you are the Christ, meaning the anointed one, the one we're waiting for, the Messiah, the promised one of God, then tell us. They weren't asking him, are you God? I believe because that had never ever even entered into their minds. They were looking for a coming Messiah, and they wanted to know, are you the one?
So, yeah, they asked him, are you the Christ? They didn't ask if he was God. I agree. But that certainly entered into the conversation. When Jesus answered, part of his answer in verse 30 is, I and the Father are one. And when he says that, their very next response is, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? The Jews answered him, it is not for a good work that we're going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. So it certainly did enter into the conversation. And I think it's a little bit dishonest at this point for Dan Gallagher to, in this video, which is all about why did the Jews want to execute Jesus, to just ignore Jesus' answer here. And this is going to be a big deal when we look at another text, but for now we'll just leave that as it is. So next we're going to jump into Matthew 26, and this is where Dan is going to spend most of his time.
I, the high priest, charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. See, there's very clearly what they were asking him. And as a result of the formula that the high priest employed in questioning Jesus, he was required to answer. If he didn't answer, then his silence was considered admission. And that's why, knowing that if he answers this, basically they're going to kill him. The reason is because recorded in John chapter 19, verse 7, it says, the Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. See, the Jews had a law that if anyone claimed to be the Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of God, then they would execute him on the grounds of blasphemy.
Did you catch it? There he was in Matthew 26. Jesus is before the Sanhedrin on trial. They've just asked him, tell us, are you before God? Are you the Christ, the Son of God? So they've just asked this question, and we're going to find out, because in Matthew 26, they are going to want to have him killed. Of course, it happens in all the Gospels. So, what did they, what was the response? What happened next? Well, Dan doesn't hang out in Matthew 26 at this point. He jumps over to John 19. Now, it sounds, from his very, very short quote, like maybe this is the same scene, but it is not. As it says, it's before Pilate. This is a later point in time after Jesus has stood before the Sanhedrin. Now they're taking him before Pilate as the prosecutors and trying to make a case. It's a different author of a different gospel, a different scene, and yet he's treating them as if it's all exactly the same and jumping from one book to another. Now, that should always raise red flags. Certainly we can use different passages to shed light on others, but we need to understand what each passage says. It's in its own context first. And when you do that with both of these passages, you find it ends up saying exactly the opposite of what he wants it to say. So we'll show how that is here in just a second.
And the rest of the assembly called for his death, not because God had a law that the Christ or the Son of God, anyone who claimed it, had to be put to death, but they had a law that claimed that.
What's amazing is he's serious. He seriously thinks that the Jews in Jesus' day had a law that said that anyone who claimed to be the Messiah should be killed for blasphemy. Really. Now we're going to get to some of that later, but first of all, let's just put that to bed. Notice he doesn't cite anything for that. He's not going to give us any information that says, here's that law, or here's where it is in, the Second Temple Judaistic writings or something like that, where we can see that they have established this law that says, yeah, if someone claims to be the Messiah, you kill them. There's no citation because there's no law. When the Jews said we have a law, they are referring to the Old Testament. They are referring to their own law. And we know this because of what happens over and over and over again in John. I mean, claiming to be the Messiah isn't blasphemy, but claiming to be God is, if you're not God. And so, let's just take a look at a couple examples here in the book of John. First example, here in John 5, verses 15 to 18. It says, "The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.' This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." And now it's important not to miss what's being said here. John is narrating what the Jews were thinking about when it came to Jesus. They were wanting to kill him because not just because he was working on the Sabbath, but because he called God his Father. Because to them, claiming God as his Father, or that he's the Son of God, makes him equal with God. This is what the Jews thought, and that is not in dispute. That can't be in dispute. John says it right there. He is very careful to record several times when they're seeking to kill him, or when they took up stones to kill him, and they never do it because he claims to be the Messiah. This is a perfect example in John 5. The next one that happens is in John 8. John 8, 57 through 59 says, "So the Jews said to him, 'You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?' Jesus said to him, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am.' So they picked up stones to throw at him, But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. And then the next one we have is the one we were just talking about in John 10. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? The Jews answered him, It is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. So that's twice now that the Jews are said to, in this case they said out loud, but they are claiming that the reason they want to kill him and they want to stone him for blasphemy because they believe he's making himself God. Now, at this point, a lot of Unitarians will say, yes, so are you going with what the unbelieving Jews thought? Well, the Jews didn't believe he was God. I'm not going with the unbelieving Jews. But they understood what Jesus was saying and doing to be acclaimed to be God. That's why they were wanting to stone him on these other occasions. So when the Jews say in the book of John that claiming to be the Son of God deserves death, that's because they understood it to mean Jesus was claiming equality with God, and that they saw as blasphemy. And that deserves death, according to God's law. Let's take a look at a passage that demonstrates this. This is Leviticus 24. And I'll do verse 11 and then 14 through 16. It says, And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name and cursed. Then they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Bring out of the camp the one who cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. And speak to the people of Israel, saying, Whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him. The sojourner as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. Now, before you object that Jesus didn't do this, I agree. I'm not saying that he did. But the Jews believed that what he did was equivalent to this, that he was blaspheming God. To them, they said, You, a mere man, make yourself God. That's what they said. And that they saw as blasphemy. So they saw it as equivalent to defaming the name of God by claiming, by being a mere man, that you are God. So in John, it's obvious that the Jews saw Jesus as claiming to be God, and that's why they wanted to kill him. But what about Matthew? When the Sanhedrin asked Jesus if he is the Christ, the Son of God, how did he respond?
Jesus responds and says, Yes, it is as you say. It's an Oriental or an Eastern way of basically saying, Yep, I am. It's true. And as soon as he heard that, the high priest declared, This is blasphemy.
So Jesus' simple affirmation that he is the Son of God triggers them to say this is blasphemy. And how do they respond?
That's why in Matthew 26, verse 65 and 66, it says, Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered.
So is that really what happened? Did you notice the clips so far? That whenever Dan Gallagher is quoting a scripture, he puts it up on the screen. But did you notice there was one verse he quoted without putting it on the screen? Let's take another look at that.
I, the high priest, charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus responds and says, Yes, it is as you say. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered.
Did you notice? He didn't put verse 64 up on the screen. They asked him in verse 63 who he is. He tells us what Jesus answered, and then he puts 65 and 66 there up on the screen as far as their answer or their response to Jesus' answer. I wonder why he didn't put the whole verse 64 up on the screen. Let's take a look at what that one says, shall we? It says, Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Now, why didn't Dan Gallagher quote that part of the verse? I think it's pretty obvious, especially when you know your Old Testament, as those Jews did, that this claim was also a claim to be God. When Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven," he's making an obvious reference to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Let's take a look at that. It says, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." Now, a lot could be said of this text, but I'm going to point out just a couple of things. The title, "The One Who Rides the Clouds," that here is given to the Son of Man, and Jesus claims that for himself, that title, outside of this one verse in Daniel, is always and only used of Yahweh, of God. It was an undeniable title of God. There was disagreement among the Jews about this particular verse, why it was that this one called the Son of Man coming up to the Ancient of Days could be said to be riding the clouds, and that's a video for another time. But definitely, outside of that one passage, every other time it's used, it is always and only about Yahweh. So when Jesus says it, it's no wonder that the high priest tears his robes and says Jesus has committed blasphemy, because Jesus is claiming that title that only God has. This would be like Jesus saying to us, "I am the only true God." It was that strong of a statement. So in his case that he's trying to make, that Jesus did not claim to be God and the Jews didn't kill him because he claimed to be God, Dan Gallagher has to cut out probably the most important part of the most important verse in the text that is just about this very thing. And not only that, but has to jump from book to book and context to context to try to piece something together in order to make his case. It's obvious if you just read through the text what Jesus is claiming and why the Jews wanted to kill him. But this type of move, these types of tactics, are pretty common for false teachers. And there's no question Dan Gallagher is falling right into that category here.